We're going to assume that most of you with us today were also there for part one, but just to briefly bring those of you who are first timers up to speed, think of this trio of webinars as an intermezzo, a mezzanine, a happy halfway house between the original EFC Research Forum conference, Trust in Science in Turbulent Times, that was to have been held in Lisbon last October, and the rescheduled one that was moved to October this year, but has now firmly and finally, we hope, moved to October 2022, still in Lisbon, still with the Gulbenkian Foundation as our host, and perhaps most importantly, still with the overarching theme of trust in science in turbulent times. Now, hopefully that is enough to put today into context, but just in case it isn't, and also to add their warm welcome, I'm going to hand over briefly to the Senior Program Manager at our hosts, the Gulbenkian Foundation, João Pedro.
Thank you, Quentin. Welcome to all to the second webinar of the series, Trust in Science in Turbulent Times. As you can see on my left side, it was expected to happen October 2020 in Lisbon in Gulbenkian Foundation, but COVID-19 changed the plans of everyone. These webinars results from the conference, the physical conference Trust in Science in Turbulent Times, organized by the Research Forum of the European Foundation Center. And this forum is a network of public benefit foundations hosted by the European Foundation Center. The European Foundation Center is a European association based in Brussels of around 230 philanthropic organizations across Europe. Our mission as a research forum is to understand where and how philanthropy could provide effective support to research. The idea is to create a long-term, broad-based network of independent research funding foundations in Europe. The topic of these sessions were identified in 2018 as a framework topic for the biannual conference to be held in Lisbon in October 2020, but we expect to have this physical event in 2022 in April again in Lisbon, and I hope that everyone can be with us in Lisbon and enjoy the good weather, but also enjoy the good conversations around science and this topic or other that we define. Foundations working in science and research have looked at the topic of knowledge resistance, science communication, and public participation even before COVID-19 in order to understand how can we help to build the trust to fight the knowledge resistance with the support of the research sector and civil society organizations. Due to the pandemic, the conference was postponed and is decided to organize this series of online sessions in order not to lose the focus on the topic and not lose the pertinence of this discussion. Takeaways from these sessions will be shared with all and continue to feed the conversation of the Research Forum conference expected to take place in Lisbon in April 2022. As Quentin already referred, the previous session was focused on mistrust in science and knowledge resistance. The next session, June 8th, will be on science participation. This current session is known to focus more on tools, how to improve effective communication on science results. In the panel, there will be different speakers, excellent speakers, wonderful speakers, with different approaches to the problem of trust in science, with pragmatic examples and updated data on this topic. The objective of these sessions is not to discuss in depth, but more to explore different perspectives and to explore the role of foundations in supporting this change. How can we say philanthropy is here to create synergies and to catalyze the change? Thank you to all speakers for accepting this challenge, and a special word for Quentin, our moderator throughout these sessions, that is doing an excellent work. Thank you, Quentin. Back to you. I hope that we have a wonderful session. And once again, thank you for being part of this challenge of discussing in the hot moment the trust issues in science when we are living still the pandemic of COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, João. And you should never thank the moderator in advance because we've still got work to do. I would also like to say, I don't know about anybody else's screen, but from mine, when I'm watching João, it said rust in science in turbulent times because the T was missing, but it is definitely trust that is our focus here. And the official title of this particular session, remember, this is, I said beforehand, that this is the sort of halfway house between the original COVID cancelled conference last year and the one now rescheduled for next year. And this being the second of the three, we are in the middle of the middle, but there is absolutely nothing middling about the content or the speakers or the importance. And we've gone with the title of Acceleration and Digitalization of Science Production and Communication. And it's worth just spending a minute to kind of parse that sentence. Acceleration and digitalization of science production and communication. That's two related processes, acceleration and digitalization, as applied to two related areas, science production and communication. So we could easily spend an entire conference on the hows and whys of any one of those intersections, but instead we're going to try and dive as deep as we can in the next 90 minutes or so into all of them. And we're going to start with 4 short presentations from 5 panelists who between them should take us from the kind of big picture down to the nitty gritty, from the kind of guiding philosophies to this to the practicalities of delivering it. And we're going to begin with an overview from Professor Volta Quattrociocchi, head of the Center of Data Science and Complexity for Society, thankfully CDCS for short, at Sapienza University in Rome. Now, Volta is particularly interested in data-driven modeling of social dynamics, such as how information and particularly misinformation spread. And he's recently published a study titled The COVID-19 Social Media Infodemic. I do love that word, infodemic, coined in 2003, I think, by a journalist at the Washington Post. So as we continue to wrestle with the evolving COVID pandemic, how important is it to also tackle the accompanying infodemic, and what are the best strategies for doing so? Our opening speaker, Professor Volta Quattrociocchi.
Thank you so much. Good morning. I will share just a bunch of slides just to follow up with a few clear points. Can you see my presentation? Perfect. Okay. So basically, when we are talking about the idea of fake news, misinformation, and so on, we were, before COVID-19, more or less oversimplifying the process. Basically, what happened in the last 10 years is just that platforms, primarily designed to entertain people, became the major spreader for information diffusion, a major source for information diffusion. This changed basically the approach to consuming, to the news diet, generically. Indeed, before COVID, we were used to listen often to conferences that fake news are evil, is a threat for Western democracy. Even the fake news that fake news travel faster than real news, that's a fake news, you know? That's a fake news. It's because the statistical validation of the process actually is really weak. So we did other 2 studies to say that the situation is totally different. The spreading of the information depends from the audience. Depends on the audience. So we get a little bit of context by simply outlining a few simple concepts, the idea of confirmation bias and the one of the echo chambers. Okay, what is confirmation bias? Is the tendency to acquire information that adhere to our system of belief and to ignore dissenting information. Okay, that's a simple rule. We did an experiment 5 years ago, 6 years ago right now, by comparing the content consumption of conspiracy pages and scientific pages on Facebook, both in the US and in Italy. The experiment was implemented with 3 million of users in the Italian case and 55 million of users on the US Facebook scenario. What we found was really simple, really simple. People following scientific information sources just follow scientific information sources. People following alternative facts just follow alternative facts. Plus, people involved in the conspiracy narrative are surrounded by people active in the conspiracy narrative. People acting in the scientific communication, people consuming scientific content are surrounded by people consuming scientific content. That's the concept of echo chamber, okay? Echo chamber. So we are, in some way, we create a group of like-minded users with which we share and frame and shape a shared narrative. Okay. How those guys, from the conspiracy point of view, respond to information that are fake by design, but coherent with their system of belief. So the first point of the experiment. What happened is that they acquire this information as they belong to their usual information sources. So it doesn't matter there is no matter about the truth value of the information. While on the second point, how users from the conspiracy side respond to information dissenting their narrative. So if you believe in chemtrails, how do you react to a post on Facebook telling that chemtrails do not exist? Actually, the reaction is to ignore the post, basically. Just a few fraction of these users interact with the debunking, fact-checking post. But the fact is that those few guys that interact with this kind of information, after the exposure to the debunking, to the fact-checking, became more active in consuming conspiracy content. So this is a sort of backfire effect. We know these results since 5 years. We know that fact-checking, as it is intended on Facebook and still played with this idea of providing the truth, doesn't work at all. Because in this polarized environment of social media, providing an authority for checking the news doesn't play any role. So we had the possibility to draft a really simple model to mimic the social dynamics online, especially on the content consumption. And the model is really simple. We can access a large amount of information. Randomly, we end up in finding the information we like the most. After that, we meet people that are there for the same with the same story. They ended up in that place because they were looking for the same kind of information. This kind of selection elicit the emergence of this echo chamber. So we start to interact virtually with people having the same worldview. And this creates a specific process in which the information is confined within the echo chamber. Indeed, the 97% of shares, so cascades, happen within homophilic users that have similar consumption pattern, interested in the same narrative. Plus, when a user is immersed in this echo chamber, the effect is to burst this scenario of harshing hate to be really negative. So this echo chamber bursts polarization. And we found this polarization process on the Brexit, on the vaccination debate. Polarization is the real problem, not fake news. Indeed, COVID-19 provided a real testbed for this kind of issue because it was a complex issue subject to a lot of uncertainty, because we were knowing how science evolved, and there were the idea that science was providing truth. Science is providing evidence that we tend to fit in a model that is something different to have the truth, because an hypothesis can be confirmed or not. So it's really difficult for the audience to become familiar with this kind of scientific dynamics. And we found, this was published just last month, that feed algorithm of Facebook and Twitter matters in the creation of polarization. So if we consume information online, if there is an algorithm providing for us content, the probability to find echo chambers of segregation of the environment is pretty higher. Indeed, Facebook is pretty much polarized than Reddit. This is the group that joined the story. That was the Washington Post column closing after our result on debunking. There was the Washington Post column run by Kathleen Dewey that was called "What Was Fake on the Internet?" And she closed the column by saying, why this is the final column, by presenting the plots I showed you before, the one about the debunking that doesn't work 5 years ago. Still people blaming this idea of debunking. Okay, so we are really, I mean, the idea of debunking that is effective against fake news probably is a bias, is our confirmation bias, because we want to think still that the human being is rational, while we have to adapt to the new situation and to improve our awareness of the processes. Otherwise, we are just designing not effective solutions. And indeed, the COVID-19 was the perfect storm. There was a complex issue to test our model, the model of this echo chamber and polarization dynamics. We did that on 5 different social media: Instagram, YouTube, Reddit, and Gab. and Facebook. And what we found exactly is that people are polarized and people look for the information they like the most. So the truth value of the information doesn't matter at all. The truth value of the information is subject to the shared belief of the echo chamber. Then there was another fake news. That is a lot of fake news against about coronavirus. Actually, it's not true. We didn't find so much fake news on mainstream social media like Facebook and Twitter. Their activity to contain the diffusion of fake news was pretty effective. The problem is that people of the echo chamber that was more or less familiar with conspiracy stories just migrated in other platforms like Gab or Parler. So we are going toward not echo chamber, but echo platforms. And now we are working with the World Health Organization, the CDC, US, EU, and China to define actually what are the real matters for that modeling and analyzing infodemic processes in a data-driven approach in these turbulent times, because we need to account on a real quantitative basis to know what is going on and to tailor correct information strategies. Indeed, we are starting a project with the G7, about this kind of global infodemic monitor, where we want to track what is going on. And we are Harvard, the University of Cambridge, Sapienza, and blah blah. And actually, it's a joint initiative because we need to take care to frame finally that the problem of trust in science is a matter of polarization on social media platforms, internet. The large amount of information didn't produce more informed people, just created more tribes. We have to be familiar with this content in order to design new solutions. Otherwise, if we were still thinking on fake news against real news, we are still running in circle from 5 years, just wasting money. We have to do something better. I hope so, at least, because sometimes it happens in conferences that, you know, the lecture about, oh, fake news is a matter of sources. We have to teach people how to be clever. Come on, people are not stupid. People don't want to be convinced that they are stupid. You have to find a way to engage them in order to provide the correct information. So it's really hard as a tendency. We cannot just say, I'm the fact checker, this is the truth and you are wrong. It doesn't work like this. And that's all. That's all from my side.
Thank you, Volta. Just before you go, I'm just going to ask one question before you move on. Yes. First of all, I wanted to say, by the way, I love that slide you started with about the confirmation bias cartoon. I do a lot of lecturing on science communication. I use exactly the same slide as well. It saves it. It kind of gets you through the start of the lecture. But you were talking a lot about the echo chamber. I mean, this is all part of humans seeking tribes, isn't it? We seek people with a common taste in clothes. We seek the common taste in music, the common taste in facts. And maybe isn't this part of why the scientific attempts to deal with this are problematic? Because we come up with the solutions that work for our tribe, but we forget that our tribe is not representative of humanity as a whole.
That's the point. That's exactly the point. Even this idea of the fake news, the information ecosystem, is so important that part of the scientific community is using these tools, this argument, for political argumentation. Science is losing its independence from the political aspect, because actually fake news is a term to mark whatever is not my propaganda. You are fake news on the other side. And this is just bursting polarization. This is just bursting polarization. While we should at least be more effective informing journalists and scientific communicators to communicate to the audience simple concepts like uncertainty and complexity. Most of the problems about AstraZeneca, for instance, in Italy at least, it happens because it was really difficult for the audience to understand what does it mean to stop, to prioritize the solution. So it's really difficult to frame the story in the correct way. And if the story is not framed in the correct way, the only effect that we can have is to improve the distrust.
Okay, I've got lots more I'd like to ask, but I want to make sure it's the audience that gets to ask the question, so we'll leave it there for now. So Professor Walter Quattrociocchi, and I think that name means 4 logs, but doubtless somebody with better Italian will correct me. But I wanted to also say a particular thanks for joining us, because we know that your daughter was only born, what, 4 days ago, so thank you for sparing us the time. 5 days ago, but maybe you're just trying to escape for a while. But anyway, now it seems highly likely some of you will have comments or questions on what you've just heard. Please do send them in via the chat box. We will get to them straight after we've heard from the rest of the panel, starting with Carlos Shakur, Assistant Research Professor at ISGlobal, which is the Barcelona Institute for Global Health. Now, long before hydroxychloroquine, I knew I'd get that wrong, received presidential endorsements, Carlos has been disputing and refuting the fanfare, the furore, and the flawed research around both it and its successor as a sort of social media miracle drug of choice, ivermectin. And he's had considerable success doing so. But in these turbulent times, how can we best build trust and help the signal of sound research stand out from the noise of quasi-science and quackery? Over to Carlos Shakur.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. Let me share my screen. I do have some slides that I hope will help us through this story. Basically, I'm going to tell you a story of something we lived last year. Can everybody see my slide? Right, thanks. All right, so I'll talk about the Surgisphere scandal and how it's been involved in the midst of what happened with hydroxychloroquine and COVID and what's now happening with ivermectin and COVID. So I'll talk about the current issue with ivermectin, and I'll try to explain why as much as I can. You will see that a lot of what I say resonates with what Walter showed before. I'll talk about the specific role of fraudulent Surgisphere publications, and then I'll talk about further consequences, and then we can have the discussion. So what's going on with ivermectin and COVID today? Well, this is from 3 days ago, headlines in India. The health ministry is considering rolling out ivermectin to not 1, but 2 whole states in India. So that's several dozens, millions of people that will receive this drug, also from India. And then now this headline from the Philippines a couple of days ago, the Philippine FDA is trying to charge against illegal traders of ivermectin. This is another one from New York. It's gone to the Supreme Court of the state, where people have disputed for doctors to be allowed to use this drug in their families. Another poor soul who was detained in South Africa trying to smuggle a high amount or a large amount of ivermectin. So several countries have included this antiparasitic drug that I've been working with for malaria and other diseases for 10 years. They have included now as part of the official treatment guidelines of COVID in these countries. The evidence to support this is limited. So there is some, but like all good lies, they have some truth in them. So that's contributed to this. And the huge amount of misinformation around this topic. So Peru was the first country to allow this in May last year. It became national practice to use it. Bolivia followed suit very closely a few days later, and they actually rolled out to 300,000 people that very week in one of the cities. Brazil doesn't have national guidelines because it's a federal state, but several federal guidelines do contain it. Venezuela included it in the national guidelines in July last week. Now this year, Slovakia in January, followed closely by South Africa, and then Zimbabwe, all in January this year. So all this movement from country authorities have had some opposition from science and regulatory authorities. The first one was the FDA of the US, who said when the first wind of ivermectin came through, already in April last year, the FDA said, hey, this is a veterinary drug, watch out, do not use it in humans. The veterinary source, there's also a human one. Because the veterinary is so available, they said, please be careful. The Pan American Health Organization issued last year as well saying, hey, there's no evidence for including this. The Mectisan donation program, which is a large donation program held by Merck, gently reminded partners that these donated drugs should not be used for anything else but neglected tropical diseases, so no COVID Merck, the manufacturer, said, hey, there's no basis for using this. There's concerns about lack of safety data in all studies being done. The NIH of the US had this very balanced comment saying, hey, their evidence doesn't support the use. It also, there's no evidence to say you should not use it, but basically there's too much uncertainty. WHO guidelines that came out a month and a bit ago, say do not use this drug for COVID outside clinical trials. So a lot of statements. Why? And why? Well, there's a public health emergency, international concern with limited treatment options. And I understand people are desperate. I have the utmost respect for my MD colleagues working, and I don't judge them, but this has been a contributor, right? Desperation and lack of options. Politics and science, and this resonates with what Walter said before, and I'll talk about hydroxychloroquine there. And there's in vitro data that came out, and then Surgisphere, I think, was the key enhancer of what happened. Politics and science, well, we all are all familiar with the hydroxychloroquine and how it was touted by the former president Donald Trump, and at this stage in March last year, this became more of a political issue. I mean, it was like people cheering for their own football team, right? Oh, I am from the Real Madrid, or I am from the Barça. I mean, it was distant from what is actually the evidence to support it, and it became more of a political thing. It crossed the Atlantic, and in France it was a big deal, and by May last year it was a huge issue, and the president is taking it. So along those lines came ivermectin. Ivermectin was proven in vitro, that is in a petri dish, to inhibit the replication of the virus, of SARS-CoV-2, at concentrations that are maybe 60-fold what you normally get with an oral dose, 60-fold. So does it inhibit the virus? Yes. Can it be done in vivo? Well, that's not so clear. But as soon as 4 days later, after that in vitro data came out, there was this preprint, which is another problem, preprint dissemination of science, showing that in this small company based in Chicago called Surgisphere had access to a large database of patients from around the world. And they had analyzed this database. There were only 1.3 million cases back then in April last year. And they showed in their data that those treated with ivermectin had an 80% survival versus 15% survival in the non-treated. There were serious issues with this analysis of the numbers, and they replaced it a few days later with another one, very similar, also showing 90% reduction of death in patients treated with ivermectin. And there were serious issues. They had gone wrong. The number of patients, for example, they had included in this first preprint, they had more patients from Africa in their database that there were cases of COVID in the continent. So these was large, remarkable problems. And so we decided to write to them. They had already made national headlines in the US, even if this was a preprint, right? Hey, this drug could save us. So we decided to write to them, my friends from ISGlobal and we reached out to the authors and said, hey, we think there's issues with this paper. They replied to us with not so satisfactory answers, but we decided to let it alone because we were not ready to engage about a preprint and have a huge fight about it. So we sort of step aside. And then 5 weeks later came this paper in the Lancet showing that a group had reviewed almost 100,000 patients and showed that hydroxychloroquine does not work and indeed is dangerous for those in COVID. Now we know that, but back then this was brand new. These had immediate consequences. The Solidarity trial, which was sponsored by the WHO, was put on hold. 131 trials around the world were affected, many in Spain. Funding decisions were had, headlines again. Trials are stopped because of fears of coronavirus. And here we are, the three of us thinking, hey, these guys from the preprint, are they again at this? So we looked at this publication in the Lancet, and they were impossible numbers again. They claimed to have reviewed 4.4 thousand patients from Africa by April 14, 2020. That was 30% of all African cases back then. And we know, having worked in Africa so many years, that only 5% of all hospitals have electronic health records. So how could they have gotten so many patients? There was also no data transfer agreement described, no IRB approval. So there were several red flags. And then we entered this week of what we called crazy pills. We really asked ourselves, hey, are we maybe too suspicious? Are we looking at things that are not there? For example, the website of this company that deal with private data from hundreds of thousands of people had no security certificate. But we decided to not go through it. One of the employees listed in LinkedIn was actually dead. But we said, hey, maybe he's not been updated. The other employee, the head of sales, we found out she is a hostess in conference. She also is an actress. We found that the scientific writer was a writer indeed, but of science fiction, selling books in Amazon. So everything was crumbling down. We wrote to the Lancet and they say, we think there's huge problems here. They actually accepted our letter for publication, and it was never published because then the press came in and they started picking on this study. And also in previous studies from the same group, now published not in the Lancet, but in the New England Journal of Medicine. So very, very prestigious journals, also with issues. And soon after, not so much because of our letters, but mostly because of press pressure, both papers were issued expressions of concerns and then simultaneously retracted a couple of days later. Simultaneous retraction in the two most prestigious medical journals. The whole timeline is very well written in The Scientist by Catherine Offord here in this article from last year. And this links to the new OCTOR in the field, the Frontline Critical Care Alliance, which is this large group of doctors in Texas saying that there's definitely proof ivermectin works and is being silenced, and actually doing trials would be unethical because there is proof already. Interestingly, they cite the fake preprints from Surgisphere. And of course, social media pressure. Lots of people out there that are convinced this work, and this is being silenced because there's some obscure vaccine lobby pushing for this. And you see it everywhere with thousands of engagement in different social media. And then say, hey, those countries that are rolling it out are winning the fight, actually using some sort of ecological data to support it. So what's the science? Well, there are more than 70 studies right now registered. Animal models, this is some models from Institut Pasteur, do show that ivermectin could reduce anosmia, so olfactory deficits in patients with COVID. And this is a hamster model. Another trial from Argentina apparently showing some benefit with high concentrations. My own trial, we did a small trial pilot to see if there was something, and there is a potential signal, but there is no clear evidence on this. What there is adverse consequences of this upbeat of this drug. Now, this is from February this year, and somebody took 7 ivermectin formulations on the market and tested them, and several of them are contaminated with other drugs, some of them dangerous. And this is because of the huge demand. In Peru, at least 5,000 indigenous people were injected with animal ivermectin formulations for the prevention of COVID. And then there's people using other stuff that looks like ivermectin, but it's not, like doramectin, never used in humans. And there it is. So this whole snowball effect, based on some data, plus social media upbeat, plus conspiracy theories, plus plain fraudulent data, all mixed together to create this. So we don't know what's going to happen. Maybe it will work. But right now there's no evidence. What there is evidence of the negative impact this has had. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Now, Walter's already said that it's fake news, that fake news travels faster than non-fake news. But does the Surgisphere story show that at least at times of crisis, upbeat news offering a potential hope, potential solutions, has more chance of not having proper editorial scrutiny than normal news stories? We're more willing to suspend our normal disbelief.
I think the editorial world was also sort of a victim to the whole politicization, right? Suddenly there's a very unpopular president asking or trying to promote some drugs, and then there comes this paper that sort of pokes him in the eye. So yeah, let's publish that. So did this have a role in getting it out so quickly? Perhaps.
And one more from me. I noticed, like Walter, you've recently written something with infodemic in the title. Infodemic, how has the epidemic of misinformation affected the response to COVID-19? Now, you've kind of covered some of the ground that's in there, and you talk about pressure points in certain areas, pressure points in terms of journals, in terms of science, in terms of the public. But I was struck because I'm a journalist. There's a line in there. You say, it is time to abandon the vices acquired during times when printed communication were the norm. And I wonder how you manage to, how do you go about persuading publishers who might not see these things as vices?
So what we mean by that is that there's so much incentives for the current publication industry that are inherited from the times when it was printed. And we're still stuck with things like word limits and charges per color pages, and there's impact factor and H factor, and the whole of academia is ruled by an industry, what has become an industry for profit, which is Elsevier and all the large publishers. So that's what we mean. And the new needs.
I know what you mean by what you're saying, but I'm wondering, how do you persuade them when they've got a vested interest in not seeing these profit as being a negative thing?
Well, one of the things I'm doing on my own is I'm signing all my reviews. I'm not doing any more blind reviews. I'm trying to use more open access. That's what I can do. I don't have an answer for how we change the publication industry. That's up to the funders.
Okay, and we will talk more about open science in the third of these webinars. So Charles, thank you for now. Again, you can please send in your questions, your comments via the chat box, and we will get to as many as we can once the panel is assembled. Next in line is the director of the Gulbenkian Institute of Science, Mónica Bettencourt Diaz. Now, Mónica is a fundamental science researcher. She's very concerned about missteps and misunderstandings that too often can arise when scientific findings and ideas are communicated to the wider public. And she's been working to think about useful tools and agencies that can reduce these errors and help the right message come through loud and clear. I hope she's now ready to come through loud and clear herself. Mónica Bettencourt Diaz.
Hello, everyone. It's a huge pleasure to be here today. And I'll talk as a scientist. And I think, in a way, I mean, after the last talk, it's almost daunting because I'm so positive about digitalization and what we have achieved so far that, you know, it's a bit daunting with all the problems that arise as we've seen it. Yeah, but I do think that given the, you know, that science, it's a huge tool to promote world development and sustainability. And we've seen that through the advances in medical science. And if we want to promote sustainability, this will be through science. It will be through science, and when I talk about science, it's both an attitude that people think critically about their surrounding world, and this links very well with what we were talking before in the previous talks, but also that we invest in improving our world through science and technology. Okay, I think in the last years, and in particular in the last one, and science itself has been transformed, and also the relationship of science with society. And this has been through what is the title of this webinar, through acceleration and digitalization of science production and communication. this has changed a lot. And I think there is a lot of potential for us to use this opportunity to improve our world. And I think it's funny in a way, because, 2 years ago, we had this model in our institute that, we were going to try new meetings for science, and we were going to start trying the hybrid meetings modes and all these things. And suddenly, all the things that look like they would take a while to implement, they are here. So our world has been transformed, and a lot of things that were taking a lot of time for us to do, they are here. And so we can really change the way we do things. And I think there's a huge opportunity here. So I'll talk first about science itself and how it works and how it has been changed. And then afterwards, the relationship of science with society. So normally, when scientists work, they share the findings through publishing, and this is something that normally takes a long time. So we have to send our findings through a journal, as Carlos was speaking. That then you have peer reviewers that will see it. It can take more than a year to review the findings. Many times our work is improved, but many times it will focus on detail and it will take a long time. Meanwhile, there might be people in another part of the world that are doing exactly the same experiments, expending a lot of resources and time that could be used to advance science. So I think this really takes too long and it doesn't work. So it's a lot of resources and a lot of time, and it doesn't make sense. And for a long time, physicists have used a different model, and also mathematicians, with archives, where they actually deposit their knowledge as soon as it is available, okay? And this is something that has been started in biology in 2013 with something called the bioRxiv, started by John Inglis and Richard Sever. And it was hosted by the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. And I think here, this is something where foundations have also played a very important role. There's a Lowry Foundation, more recently, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative that has been also funding the archives. More recently, there's not just the bioRxives, but also the medRxiv has been created. And this is very important for, when we are talking about the COVID crisis and all these recent publications that are put out in the open, because here in the medRxiv, there are certain rules that have to apply to ensure or try that things like Carlos was talking do not happen, that there's registers, clinical trial registrations, and there are people reading those preprints before to ensure that in principle there would be no problems about them. But there's a lot of discussion about this. I think this is a very important point. But just to say that I think because of this preprint method whereby you post your findings before you submit to a journal, and they're out in the open, and this again is digitalization and again also open access, there's been a huge transformation. And I'll just say, like an example from my own work, I submitted the work, then in the preprint server. The next day, there's a group from Japan that puts the same work out there, not the same, slightly different findings, but competing work clearly. And when I submitted to the journal, the reviewers already saw the other work and they questioned me about what was different between the two works. Yeah, so immediately, it's much faster, it's much better, because, the reviewers can look at the two different opinions, the different experiments on the same problem, and immediately ask me to improve my work or to discuss the other work so that we can, advance much farther, much faster. Also, because now so many people deposit things in the archives, and here at the IGC, most of the work is deposited first on the archives. We can move much faster. So I'll give you another example. One of our researchers, she's been developing new tests for COVID, basically. And by using some of the tests that she has been doing, she's been studying the virus variants and how they may escape immunity or not. And she actually posted some of this work on the archives also very recently, and immediately a company contacted her because they wanted to use these tests in the work that this company is also doing to develop new ways of diagnosing COVID. So both in the relationship between science and scientists, and in the relationship between science and industry, for example, you see that things move much faster because we have them in the digitalized world out there in the open very soon. So I think this is a huge transformation of science. It's also a huge discussion in terms of how to go further on this, but I think things basically, science becomes more collaborative, and we see this in COVID. It clearly, a lot of people were posting things and other scientists reading, criticizing, building on that, and then the other ones from another part of the world building on that, okay? So if we don't think about the negative aspects of this, about people picking this information, some of it not being peer reviewed, from the science aspect, this is fantastic. This is a huge transformation. Science is more collaborative, is faster and more transparent. And so I think this is the first stop that I make, and think also about philanthropy. And I think philanthropy so far in this advancing to this science, which is more open, has played a very important role in funding a lot of initiatives. And I think philanthropy should play a very important role with scientists in thinking about the future of science and supporting pilots to try new avenues. So if we want a more open and collaborative future, how can we make it happen? How do we train scientists for being collaborative and more open about their research? How do we evaluate scientists as their production may be much more mixed with the production of other people? We are used to thinking about the scientist and the journal and the impact, and this will be different if we want a more collaborative and open science. So I think here, this is where philanthropy, because it's faster and more flexible, can actually fund trials to explore new models of how science should be. I also think that the future of scientific meetings will be completely different. And this is something that we also have been thinking about a lot about at the IGC. And I think we really have to run trials, because it doesn't make sense that people spend all their time traveling for sometimes, learning very few things. But it does make sense that for certain aspects, you need the human contact. So I think thinking of where we should invest in more human contact and where things should just be like we are doing it now, I think it's a very important aspect that we should also play with different models. Okay, so now I've discussed science with science and the future of science itself. And now I think the other sides, when we talk about digitalization and science communication, that I think it's super important and super important for us at Gulbenkian, it's the relationship of science with society, okay? And I think here the digitalization has also made a huge difference. And again, pandemics forced us to move much faster than what we thought, in any time we would have moved. So, so the first thing, and this relates to the previous talk, is that science itself has been moving very fast. Yeah. So science is there in the open, and anyone, any newspaper can go to the preprint and read it. And as we just heard, some of the preprints may not have the right sort of data. Yeah. So I think this raises a lot of questions in terms of training people to go through data, okay? So I think people have to be more critical. This is something that we are very keen on. We have programs at the IGC to promote from kids to grown-ups to think more critically. We have co-creation programs with teachers and with citizens to promote science in society, okay? So that's one thing. But the other thing is really, thinking about the archive model and thinking how it should work. So should they be curated as they are doing nowadays? Should they not post everything as they are also doing and being more careful? I think that probably makes sense. There's also people, and one of my colleagues, Joana Sá, that does research on fake news. She's actually advocating that maybe there should be different levels of access to different people. And so I think that's also another interesting question, whether we want to go that route. I mean, the other thing when we think about society is really that digitalization is really a superpower that we have. We really can reach new audiences to communicate science everywhere, okay? So for example, we in our institute, we hosted the open days of the IGC where we receive local people. This year we actually, or last year, at the end of last year, we hosted a virtual open day. So here people from everywhere could join, okay? So this is something where we really can reach the whole world. So this is huge, it's amazing. So I think here, so for example, our program, the Lab in a Box, that we are doing locally to train students and as I said, a co-creation program with teachers. We're also doing it now to several countries in Africa, to the Portuguese-speaking countries. And this is also much easier to do, at least the first phase, digitally, okay? Because you can reach much further, okay? So we really have, we can reach the whole world, which is great. On the other hand, we also have to think about the limitations. There's nothing like a scientist encountering a student in a school or a citizen, yeah? The contact is very important for that the lay person, but also the scientist. This is some, you know, there's nothing like human contact. So again, I think we have to think about what are the things that we can do in the digital world and what are the things that we should still keep in proximity, because that's a very important aspect of human nature. The other thing is that through the fact that we have digitalization, we cannot forget that there are people that we are leaving out. So there's, for example, we have a lot of old people here in Portugal that do not access the digital world, and we still have a lot of people that do not have access to computers. So I think we have to be very conscious about the limitations of digitalization. So, and just another example of things that we've done recently, we've done with several institutes in Portugal, research institutes, we've done a huge program to sensitize people to vaccination called Decades of Research for Days of Vaccine. And because we could do it digitally again, we could reach a huge audience. So I'll finish now, but I'll just say that, you know, as a biologist, this is really an exciting time to work, not just because biology is really transforming the world, and I think it's really going to promote a better world and more sustainable world, but also because we can really change the way science is done for the better, but also we can change the relationship of science with society for the better again. And I think this is where philanthropy, again, can have a very important role in promoting, in thinking, in studying how these things can be done, and in promoting experiments so that we really assess how we want the future to be and what's the best way of going into that future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mónica. I can see why you're so, first of all, it's great to see a speaker who talks with their hands even more than I do. But I can also see why you were chosen for this, because A, you seem very positive about the role of foundations. B, you seem very positive about the role of science. C, you seem to be positive even about the fact that the pandemic may be helping accelerate these kind of changes. So do you think we can actually turn the tide?
I think we can. So but I'm positive. Yes, scientists in general are positive. So otherwise you wouldn't be doing science, because we encounter so many difficulties and we have to be persistent. Yeah, so that's a trait that we have. But you know, if we don't think in a positive way, what's the point of this? So we have to think in a positive way. And I think as horrible as pandemics has been, because it has been really horrible for many people, for everyone, for all of us, I think the fact that we have transformed the way we live and we've tried things for a long time in a way that we can change our habits, we can really now think, stop, think, and change things for the better. And there's a lot of things that we can change for the better. And this is the opportunity to do it.
Thank you for now, but I do want to move on because I want to get as many questions in as possible. We've got one more short presentation and then we will open it up to everybody. That last presentation is a joint one by the co-authors of a recently published study commissioned by the European Parliament. Its title, I think, is fairly self-explanatory: Disinformation and Science, a survey of the gullibility of students with regard to false scientific news. But it should be worth stressed at the start, though, although this research was carried out last spring during the COVID pandemic, it wasn't originally conceived with COVID in mind. To tell us a bit about what was behind it, the results and the insights from it, we've got co-authors Gheorghe Șapeli, Professor Emeritus at ELTE University in Budapest, and first Ramona Velea, Deputy Director and Researcher at the Institute of International Sociology at Gorizia in Northeast Italy.
Thank you very much, Quentin. Thank you, everybody. Good morning. We will try indeed to be brief. Indeed, first of all, I would like to thank the amazing speakers we just heard. Very inspirational, an amazing food for thought, I would say. We hope that we will give you some food for your plate spot as well. By going back in time, as Quentin was saying, to the pre-pandemic era. Indeed, we would like to share with you very briefly the results of the study on disinformation and science, which was, as Quentin was saying, designed pre-pandemics, but then you would see all about our data collection and the struggle to get out there and to get answers during the first wave of the pandemic. Now, very briefly about the study, it was group work. We were a numerous group of researchers coming from 6 countries in Central Europe: Austria, Croatia, Czech Republic, Hungary, Northern Italy, where I'm speaking from, and Slovakia. Numerous universities and research centers have contributed to this, and the survey was supported indeed by the European Parliament. It was presented recently to the Cultural Committee as well. So the main purpose of our study was indeed that of investigating perspectives on fake news among undergraduate university students in the countries under focus. We started to collect data just when the COVID-19 pandemic started as well. So we did struggle to get answers. We managed to get around 2,300 replies to our online survey across the 6 countries, which we believe to be some solid food for thought when we talk about disinformation and science. Now, I will pass the floor to my colleague, Professor Cepeli, to give you a brief introduction on the theoretical background of the research. Professor Cepeli?
Thank you, Ramona, and I'm very grateful that we can take part in this extremely interesting panel. I would like, as a sort of introduction, just to tell about the key concept behind this research, which is gullibility. And when we are thinking about gullibility, then first we have to take into consideration the political context, because I really do think, and probably you share my belief, that democracy and democrats are the basis of European society now, and without well-informed citizens who are able to distinguish between facts and fables, European democracy simply cannot work. And I think that the distinction between misinformation and disinformation may be important, because misinformation is something which is just false, while disinformation, this is a fabricated kind of misinformation. And as we had seen in the previous presentation, both kind of fake information should be taken into consideration when we investigate this problem. And Ramona also spoke about that the survey was carried out in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, and an infodemic was unleashed, and certainly it had influenced the results. And we really do think that science can be one of the major means combating the fight against fake news, misinformation, and disinformation. Next slide, please. This is about the psychology of gullibility, and this is just a flow chart. The process does start with disbelief in true statements, belief in false statements, and ignorance. Both, all 3 symptoms are very important: disbelief in true statements, belief in false statements, and ignorance. Perhaps ignorance is the starting point. Later we can talk about it. Emotions, which is very important, follow the tendency to believe fake news, and the major constituents of the emotional states which we are referring: frustration, anxiety, fear and hope, disgust and attraction. From a cognitive point of view, on the emotional grounds, the availability heuristics play a central role, which do lead attribution errors, especially in case of conspiracy theories. We can see how attribution errors can work. And of course, there are self-serving bias based on the need for rationalization. And I think that the general psychological framework we can call the closed mind, which is a well-known state of our, not mine, but of many people, state of the worldview. Next, about the sociology of gullibility, I think that what we have to take into account in the long run it can be important, is a general decline in trust in science. There is a decline in role of elite, of course, as a result of many factors, but in our case, this decline in trust in science is an important factor. Perhaps scientists are not completely innocent in this decline, because there's a kind of flawed science communication, closed communication, echo chamber of science news, which cannot reach the audience properly. I think that the basic and most important sociological cause is, which was already blended by Ortega y Gasset about 90 years ago, when he spoke about the revolt of masses. And I think that the medium for revolt of masses has arrived now in the name of the social media. So actually this is the medium which promotes the revolt of the masses. And this new information ecosystem in many channels certainly contribute to the spread, as we have heard, the infodemia and false news. And finally, there are false prophets. So the social media doesn't work as a mechanism, but there are hubs, and in the hubs of the social media, there are the false prophets, influencers, who certainly contribute and promote the spread of misinformation, and in many cases, unfortunately, disinformation as well. So this is a background, and now let's have a look at the results.
Thank you very much, Professor. Very briefly, a few words on the study before we pitch the main results. This is what we felt all to the data collection process, a bit like Sisyphus trying to get this answer. So just for you to know, we used an online questionnaire, a standard one, translated into 6 languages. Data collection went parallelly in all the 6 countries. Our targets undergraduate students from social sciences backgrounds, but also more technical sciences background. So before going to the results, the structure of the questionnaire, because the results, of course, is going to reflect this structure, we were interested to know a bit about news consumption patterns and habits among our sample. We then went into fact-checking whether or not students are aware of these tools and if they are using them. A star set of questions, true or false statements. We proposed to students 12 news headlines. Some of them were false, some of them were true, and we tried to request what was the likelihood to be true or false in the mind of our students of these questions. And then, of course, we focused a lot on the issue of trust, given that previous studies put trust in a very strong relation with the propensity of accepting fake news, and we will see that some of these hypotheses are confirmed. Now, results, we elaborated, of course, 6 country reports, and we are now going to a very big detail of all these country reports. No, just kidding, of course. We are now going to try to give you an overview of the aggregated data analysis we performed on all the countries, but just for you to know, there are specific focuses within the study which is available online for each of the countries participating to the study. Very quickly, news consumption habits among our students. Not surprisingly so, main preferred sources of information of the students tend to be internet-based sources of information and social media, as opposed to more traditional sources of information such as radio, television, and printed media. Interesting here to see that fact-checking tools are not very known among our sample. However, whenever they are known, there is a tendency to use them, which seems logical, but it is confirmed by most of the samples, especially by the Italians, where 90% of those who are aware of the existence of such tools declare to use them on regular basis. For what concerns the issue of trust, now the situation is not very positive. Maybe it was also on account of the fact that we ran this survey just in the first days and weeks of the pandemic. So levels of trust are quite low among our sample, among our students. However, this was an interesting set of questions which led our colleagues in Slovakia to find a significant, statistically significant correlation by which distrustful students or students that declare themselves to have low levels of trust, interpersonal trust, trust in the others, trust in the future, they are the profile that tend to believe in fake news, apparently. So I think this is an interesting food for thought. Now, another interesting point on the issue of trust comes from the set of questions regarding the trust in different media sources. So we saw that the main sources of information, the preferred sources of information of our students are the internet-based one, social media. So surprisingly, these are as well the least trusted sources of information. So this is of interest for us, of course, and I think it relates pretty well with what Professor Quattrocchi was saying earlier, with the idea that the truth value of information does not seem to matter sometimes. So it makes us wonder, why do we seek for information if we're not interested in having the truth under that information? Now, the set of questions, true or false statements, allowed us to play a bit and construct what we call the profiles of gullibility or of credulity. So we define a credulous person, a gullible person, somebody that would accept fake news and would dismiss real news. So fortunately, let's say that all in all, in different levels of intensity, the proportion of non-credulous students, it's a bit more than the credulous one across the 6 countries, which is indeed a positive insight to have. However, there is definitely a tendency to believe in fake news across all the countries. It is interesting to note, maybe also for colleagues that are working in science communication, the fact that real news, for some reason, they are more difficult to be spotted as opposed to fake news. Another interesting result that comes out of the true or false set of questions is that, just to give you an example, so one of the fake headlines we propose would be gender studies increase the number of transgender persons in society. A true, for instance, headline would be, that was a false one indeed, and a true one would be life expectancy in Eastern Europe is lower than in Western Europe, or today scientists are not able to predict an earthquake. So just for you to have an idea of these 12 sentences, 12 news headlines we proposed. It was interesting to note that when it comes to technical scientists, natural science discourse, students were very relaxed in admitting that they didn't knew if that statement was true or false, so they had also this option. However, for issues such as gender studies increase the number of transgender people in society. So let's say topics that are quite debated in the public sphere. We could see that students, even though they didn't have the right question, the right answer, they were already opinionated. So not that much informed, but opinionated. So they expressed an opinion on whether or not that statement was a true or a false one. So we believe this to be quite of interest. In terms of trust in the future, indeed, situation was not that positive. Students were rather pessimistic, especially in Italy and Hungary. However, it was interesting to note that most of the samples, most of the students across the samples stated that they believe things are going in a right direction in Europe as opposed to the homeland. So these were the main results, and of course there are plenty other details in the study. So just to recap on the main insights, of course, there is a tendency to believe in unreliable scientific statements across the 6 countries among our sample. Good news is that non-credulous students, they are a bit more than the credulous one. trust was proven to be interpersonal trust and social trust generally. They are connected with the propensity of accepting fake news. So on these issues, I think it's worthwhile to investigate more, also in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic, which back then, 1 year ago, we didn't have the chance to really get to it in terms of a topic. And indeed, the fact-checking tools available, if they are known, they tend to be used. So that for sure it is a contribution to what we should do in terms of promoting, counteracting fake news. To Professor Ciappelli, the floor to propose for the further proposals part. Thank you. Am I alone in the meeting?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Can you hear me now?
Thank you, Professor.
Show me the last slide. Show me this last slide, Ramona. Yes. So probably one of the most important proposals that we would like to carry out a pan-European survey, because our sample was extremely limited, only university students and only 6 countries of Central Europe. Perhaps a pan-European survey involving representative samples would be important to monitor the state of gullibility in our societies. The education is extremely important, and capacity building. Consumers and prosumers of consumers and producers of social media should be trained to use fact-checking. This was emphasized by Ramona as well. Awareness raising across all segments of society would be extremely important, not just in this field, but in the field of political and cultural and other spheres of news producing segments of society. Scientific communication, I already mentioned the responsibility of scientists in communication. So certainly we shall have to improve, enhance the level of scientific communication in order to fight against misinformation and disinformation in science. The value of trust is a general and probably the basic value in the life of all society. So trust toward the sources of communication is a pillar of democratic society as well. And finally, the COVID-19 situation, certainly we do not know enough about the virus, about the infomedia, about the environment. So certainly more studies should be promoted. And just the last sentence, I had a conclusion from this, from the results of this study, that perhaps not the knowledge is important in the future, but the tendency to confess that I don't know. So perhaps what we have to create is a kind of ignorance, but this ignorance should be open, should be something which stimulates to questions, because critical thinking cannot be imagined without questions. So the problem with the false knowledge, of course, that is closed, but also scientists also have the tendency to be arrogant and to be overambitious, to emphasizing their knowledge. However, real knowledge is something which never ends.
Okay, thank you, Professor Gheorghe Ciappelli and Ramona Villar. Come and complete our panel. We'll almost complete this, because I did say right at the start, this is a European Foundation Centre Research Forum webinar with the emphasis on foundations and what foundations can do, more of, less of, and differently. So we were very keen to get a particular foundation-related comments and questions from yourselves, but we've also got a key foundation player as a sort of bonus contributor. That is Madeleine Rosconi, who's responsible for fundraising at the Compagnia di San Paolo Foundation, which I think is coming up for about 450 years of promoting cultural, civil, and economic development. Madeleine, I think you've got a couple of things you want to get out there.
Yes, thank you to everyone. It was very inspirational, I say. And just to recap, in all the sessions of our seminars, the underlying question has been how to protect the core pillar of science from the consequences of disinformation, but at the same time, maintaining openness, dialogue, and transferring knowledge, maximizing impact on society, which is one of the core actions, aims of the foundations. This is particularly true also in time of acceleration of production of research, in time of urgency, as many of you already had the chance to remark. So like Quentin saying, we are very keen to understand from you what we could do better or improve, of course. So one first question, which I would like to send out to you, in particular, I would say to Professor Chaccour, sorry, I mispronounce every name, and Professor Bettencourt, is if a research funding foundation want to support even more research environment, this also in fighting possible negative behaviors with regard to method integrity, and just to remind some of the outcomes of the research that you mentioned, what could be the alert mechanisms that foundation could encourage setting to place when funding research communities or adopt themselves internally to monitor risk of fraud, misconduct, or gross misinterpretation? This is also important, not only when funding research, when evaluating our research programs. Professor Bettencourt, for example, has mentioned a higher level of collaboration among researchers, preprints, peer reviews. Do you have other suggestions? Can the most recent artificial intelligence applications play an active role in playing a watchdog, but at the same time encouraging collaboration? And another question, another item, issues that have arisen among you is we have the sense that some of the way that many scholarly publications are crafted today and evaluated could be a cause of some of the conflicts or misalignments or tardiness of some research developments. What could be the alternative? For example, we know about the Coalition S initiative. Is it an alternative? Are there other alternatives that the foundation could foster, encourage, support, like open access? That's all.
Okay, Carlos, a lot of different things to pick up on there, very little time. So the shortest answer you are comfortable with.
Well, certainly funders have played a key role in starting to change the way science is disseminated. Right? You have the Wellcome Trust, the NIH, the Gates Foundation now all request open access publishing. There's further developments you can put out there to monitor and control the risk of fraud or misinterpretation. One of the mechanisms up there is open protocols. Right now, several dissemination platforms accept a project, so to say, publish the protocol, and then have the commitment to publish the outcome regardless of the publication. And this removes publication bias, and it serves to make the whole process very transparent. From the moment you set out goals and objectives and methods that are openly available to the when it's implemented or research is done, and then when it's disseminated. And I think that's one method that is already out there that you could emphasize to sort of try to manage to some risk, to some extent, the risk of fraud.
Okay, Mónica, is this the way ahead? A pack of watchdogs?
Yeah, so very quickly, I think this idea of the open protocols, it's very important. So for example, we have transformed now all our, the lab books where we write our research into the digital world. This makes things much more transparent. It's not cheap. So I think this is something that you can help countries that have more difficulty in doing this and actually sharing ways of doing this throughout the world. I think that's very important. Reproducibility also, I think there are initiatives also that people reproduce across different places. Very important research. I think that's really important. Regarding AI, you are completely right. And these are initiatives that people, even to screen the preprints and understand whether this could be enriched in fake news sort of things. Now there are new algorithms and people developing them so that they could also work as watchdogs, as you were saying. So I think this is also a very important way to go forward.
Thank
Yes.
you. It would be fake news to say that all of our speakers today were well under their allotted time. So shockingly, we have only got officially about 5 minutes left. I will get in as many questions as I can, but it won't be many. But this one I think is specifically to Mónica. It's from Rasmus Larsson at Novo Nordisk Foundation. It says the Portuguese society has a lot of respect for science and scientists, whereas the Danish doesn't to the same extent. What is Portugal doing right, and what could we learn here in the north? And I think we can generalize that to say, how do we deal with the fact that country to country, area to area, region to region, there are these huge variations?
Now, I think this is a very important question where we really need the sort of research that we've just seen to understand what and how things are and how we want them to be in the future. So the question is whether, you know, there is a curve where people that don't have a lot of information are more trustful. When you have a bit of information, you start to be less trustful. And if you know a lot, then you can go through the information and then you'll be more trustful again. And whether Portugal will be sitting or where we still have not a lot of information and we need much more information, so we would be more trustful. But I'm now completely speculating, but just saying that I think we really need more research on this sort of field to understand what makes people trust science, what is the best way of engaging with people in the future. Yeah.
Walter, Ramona, is this what you were sort of moving towards by saying you could expand your study to take in other European countries?
Are you talking with me?
I was.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Oh, well, it's strange because, I mean, if I heard well, I mean, you were talking about artificial intelligence to contrast fake news stuff. Is that correct? I heard that the application of artificial intelligence to contrast fake news. That's what actually is really unfeasible because the definition of fake depends on the assumption, so there will be no algorithm of artificial intelligence that is able to recognize a fake news. So still, we are in the middle of the discussion that is trying to kind of confirmation bias, creative thinking to spot out strange stuff. I mean, even the definition of Gullible, like, as I was listening in the previous conversation, was kind of people not accepting fake news are Gullible. People accepting fake news are Gullible. Who labeled the information, fake or not fake? So it's totally out of consistent. How do you publish that work?
It's back to what we were saying before about tribes, isn't it? People who share our views aren't gullible, they are wise. People who have different perspectives, that we can call them gullible because they're not like us.
So fake news is whatever is not my propaganda. While scaling up this process on the complexity of the COVID-19 and communicating science doesn't apply at all, because science is not grounded on the concept of truth, it's grounded on the concept of uncertainty.
Okay, another question here, which from my particular bias as a science journalist, I'm very keen to get in. And this is from Carthage Smith at OECD GSF. What is the role for science journalists as intermediaries between science and citizens in promoting trusted information? I'm amazed we've got this far and we've not given the media the usual kicking it gets. Who would like to take that one? I am going to look at, let's try Madeleine.
Can I give the word to Bettencourt? She raised her hand.
I only thought we'd heard quite a lot from Mónica, and much as I love her, I was trying to share it around. But Mónica, get in there.
No, I think journalists play a very important role, and actually during the COVID crisis, for example, the Portuguese journalist has been fantastic, though some of the journals and newspapers, but also globally. I think now everyone is much more used to searching, the New York Times, the Guardian, newspapers from everywhere in the world, and I think science journalism has had a very, very important role. So I think they do have, and I think scientists engaging with the journalists is very important in terms of trying to get the news out there, and also, understanding what is the best way of communicating from the side of scientists and the side of journalists.
Okay, we are officially out of time, but I'm going to sneakily, cheekily put in one last question to bring us back to what we said, which is about the role of foundations. We've heard about a huge range of factors, a lot of areas where there's both room for improvement and established wisdom on how to improve. So bearing in mind this focus on foundations and the difference they can make, can I get each of you to say where you think we kind of get the most bang for our buck? What's the most effective thing for foundations to be doing? And we'll start with Walter. Walter, you're not on if you're trying to speak to us. Walter, you are muted. Or maybe you're just stalling for time.
Yes, I mean, the best way, I mean, to my point is that there is a lot of fake news around this issue, a lot of fake studies on this issue, and that's a problem. Then, in order to define a good profile, in order to assess something real, not just speculation, would be to define the problem as it is. Then starting, for instance, we started a strong collaboration with Facebook, Google, and the other foundations to monitor what is going on in terms of the polarization on two simple specific issues, that is vaccine hesitancy and climate change. So what is the perception? For instance, that I can just announce a little bit of the study, is that despite the large amount of fake news, the vaccine acceptance is stable. So this kind of information is not changing, it's not impacting the vaccination protocol of the users. So I think that we are defining a problem in order for some people to be useful. And so we are distorting the problem. If we start from this, probably we can start to join a kind of alliance among platforms, foundation, and scientists, real scientists, not speculation and blah, blah, people publishing and doing papers, in order to assess and correct the problem as it is.
Yeah, by observing, we seek to understand the universe, but we only understand the universe subject to our observations. Kierkegaard, I seem to remember. Carlos.
So what I think is the best value for money, it's recognizing the process of science is beyond a few experiments, right? We normally foundations are focusing on a project or a single project that could be a simple experiment or a complex series of experiments, and you need to recognize that the process is beyond the involvement of the scientists is beyond getting out the results from these specific experiments. And there's a lot of accessory activities that a scientist has to do day to day, and that is contribute to peer review, pre and post publication, keep up to date. So if there's clear allocation of time and effort to additional efforts that have to be put in place in order for science to be transparent, that provides some base to improve the current perspective, which has some flaws.
Okay, thank you. I'm asking everybody to keep it brief. Ramona. Hang on, finger up.
So sorry, I have double mics here. Very briefly, I totally agree with what was said before. I would just want to add one point. I would advocate for cooperation in between scientists, scientific community, but also partnering up with civil society organization, grassroots organization, which promote counter fake news rhetoric and maybe could support as well capacity building and training activities. I'm here, of course, focused on the students and what we did, but I think in this we could also have some benefit or some support from the funding entities and so on and so forth. So partnering up also with civil society, which could be a watchdog on these topics as well as many others. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ramona. Georgi? Again, small pause for microphone to come on. You are still muted, Georgi.
Yeah, now you can hear me. Probably I would promote programs with schools in the field of science education, because I think this whole problem has not come from nothingness. It comes from socialization defaults. And if schools and students and teachers are included into the process of education and enhancing awareness concerning non-evidence based knowledge, that's false knowledge, I think we would go further.
Okay, thank you. And penultimately, Mónica?
Yeah, I think the role of foundation is really to try new things, to dream about a much better future and how do we reach there, you know, with big steps, so with risky things. And I think here, what Jorge was saying in terms of how do we educate people for a better world with, you know, science as a background, I think it's very important and it's a very good challenge. But the other one is how do we train scientists? Scientists are not trained for cooperating, for being open and transparent, to communicating with society. All these things are huge challenges, and I think we have to transform the way we train scientists.
Which is something foundations can hopefully make a difference with. And finally, from the foundations themselves, Madeleine.
Yes, thanks again. I think all of us have really taken home a lot of messages. I have only one last remark that does not need an answer, but further reflection. Do we need new professional science communicators, or do we want researchers self to have in them some of the skills? So because it's a whole different approach, because I think that also organizations need to take responsibility of some of the trends. So I think there is a medium-term reflection that we need to do, and that also foundation can play a role in enhancing a new set of professions that need to work with researchers, but at the same time understand the measure that some skills of transparency, communication, understanding must be part of the baggage, whatever you call, background of the researcher self. I don't want an answer, it's just a huge question mark. Thank you.
Rhetorical question taken, but we don't have history communicators, we don't have geography communicators. Why do we have science communicators? It should be maybe part and parcel of it. I'm afraid that is where we're going to have to leave it, because we are considerably over time, and I know people have got things to do and places to go. But I hope you've enjoyed this. Before we go, my thanks to everyone on our panel: Carlos Chaccour, Professor Gheorghe Cepeli, Madeleine Rosconi, Mónica Bettencourt Diaz, Ramona Velea, and Professor Volta Quattrociocchi. Now, I'd normally pause for applause for everyone, but that's the thing about doing this online. You have to hope you're appreciated, but it's hard to show that appreciation. Thanks also to the backstage team, especially Julia Lombardi, and of course to yourselves for your comments, for your questions, and just being with us to the end. When I say end, though, this is not the end properly. It's only the end of this chapter. We have one more webinar to go. Next time around on June the 8th, in the last of these 3 linked webinars, our theme will be science participation. And whether or not you are a scientist, we hope you can join us and participate. Until then, though, goodbye and good luck putting the ideas from today into action. Thank you.